Hello everybody. Welcome to Oakwood on a beautiful fall day, a little chilly but nice sun to warm us up. Today we're going to do something a little different, and that is we're going to talk about the cemetery itself as opposed to the people who are in the cemetery. In fact, there are very few people that will even mention today. As you know, we celebrated last year the 150th anniversary of the chartering of Oakwood Cemetery. The chartering, that is all the legal work, some anticipation of financing, that sort of thing. In a way, that's the easy part, because once you've got it chartered, once you've decided to create a new cemetery, then you have to design it, and then you have to build it. That's what we're going to deal with today, the architecture of Oakwood Cemetery. By that I don't mean the buildings necessarily, though they're a part of it, but the general design and the creation of it. That took a lot of work, and you understand it was work done in 1869 and 70 by hard labor. There were no backhoes, powered backhoes and that sort of thing. It took 20 to 30 men working out here for a long time to create the cemetery. But what was it going to look like? What were the choices that the Raleigh Cemetery Association had? And we're going to go through some of those. Think of your classic church cemetery, a church downtown, not in Raleigh, but in general. I have a sample to show you here. This is one possibility for them, what I call the clutter cemetery. I don't know what the official term of it is. This is St. Philip's in Charleston, downtown Charleston. I think John C. Calhoun, among others, are in the St. Philip's churchyard. But notice there's really no order to those stones. Why? Because there's not much land, so they had to make as efficient use of the land as they could and put people wherever they had a vacant spot. That was a choice here, but it's unnecessary. Why? Because there's plenty of land here. Initially anyway, once the cemetery got rolling, about 35 acres. It eventually doubled over the years, but we'll talk more about that later. Anyway, let's see what other choices the Raleigh Cemetery Association had in designing this cemetery, that is, creating the architecture of Oakwood. Come with us. All right, there's another way to organize a church cemetery or any cemetery, and this was an option, I suppose, for the Raleigh Cemetery Association. We do have an example of it right here at Oakwood. This is the Hebrew Cemetery, and the way it's arranged is what you might call row on row. It's just several rows. They're straight rows. There are no family plots that are segregated by iron fences or yard markers in the ground. Instead, everything is laid out nicely and neatly, and in fact, Oakwood Cemetery could have been arranged that way if they'd chosen to do it. They chose something else. They had a different idea as opposed to a cluttered cemetery or a row on row, and we'll see what they decided in a minute. All right, as many of you know, Oakwood does have another example of a row-on-row cemetery. Everything simply lined up in order. And of course, this is a very formal cemetery. This is the Field of Honor, dedicated in the 1990s, where veterans and their families can be laid to rest. Again, a very formal arrangement. A very important part of Oakwood Cemetery, but it's not the architecture that the RCA chose. Let's look some more. All right, so we have gotten Oakwood chartered, and we've seen some of the designs that the Cemetery Association could have chosen for Oakwood, just a sort of a catch-as-catch-can clutter effect, or the row on row. You've seen a few examples right here in Oakwood, but instead the Cemetery Association chose another plan, and it was one that had emerged in Europe, and we have a a sample of it here. This is a cemetery in Paris called Père Lachaise, founded originally in 1818, I think, very early in the 19th century. And you see how different and distinct this design is from the row on row. In fact, it looks like a public park, which is what the intent was. This is called a landscaped or garden or rural cemetery. It goes by all those terms. An expert might distinguish between them, but I think all of those terms describe this cemetery architecture. That is much like a public park, designed deliberately to reflect aspects of the natural world. And we're going to talk about that in more detail as we go along. The design came to the U.S., especially at Mount Auburn Cemetery, which is in Cambridge, Mass., and even to the American South. Oakdale, I think, was one of the first of our landscape cemeteries in North Carolina, down in outside Wilmington. So again, in a way, a new design concept, and that was the one that was chosen by the Cemetery Association. Now, they had to find a man to design that, and they did. We have a little audio vision for you here. A fellow named H.A. Engelhardt. This is his book. He wrote it in 1872. But before that, the Cemetery Association hired him to design Oakwood. Now, he was born in what's now Germany, in Prussia, and he came to the U.S. in 1851, apparently went to New York City and actually worked on Central Park for a time, came south, and was hired to design Oakwood Cemetery. The features that we're going to see now as we go through Oakwood reflect his design, which reflects the whole concept of a classic landscape cemetery. So let's look around Oakwood and see examples of what Engelhardt suggested that we do. All right, so now you've met Heinrich Engelhardt, and he is the fellow who's going to design our landscaped or garden cemetery. And here, in fact, is the plan that he presented to the Raleigh Cemetery Association in 1869. You see how it is a big garden, and that was the point. A natural area for burials, not row on row. And what we thought we'd do would be to go through the cemetery and show how it reflects the principles that he talked about in his book. What's the most important one for a garden cemetery, according to Engelhardt? That the topography, that is the lay of the land. And what he suggested was gentle hills and undulations, to take a quote out of his book. And if you've been to Oakwood Cemetery, you well know that you are going up and down as you travel. And as you view the place, it is really rolling hills. And that would, of course, delight Engelhardt. Let's go and see some of the other principles that he talked about that are reflected in Oakwood. All right, I've moved behind the wheel of our golf cart here, replacing our driver and filmographer, Robin Simonton, who does such a good job as both, to talk about another principle that Engelhardt wanted to see in Oakwood or any cemetery, any landscaped or garden cemetery, and that is winding, curving roadways, so that every turn you made would provide a new scene for you. You see that in other landscape cemeteries, such as Hollywood up in Richmond. Some of you have probably visited it. Look at that. Looks like a bowl of spaghetti. much bigger cemetery than Oakwood, but the principle is the same. If you've been to Oakwood, you know, if you look at our map, that it much reflects what we see at Hollywood. And exactly the sort of thing that Engelhardt would suggest for a cemetery. His point being that the road through a cemetery is not intended to get you from point A to point B as quickly as possible. The road through a cemetery is to let you take your time and to get a constant change of vistas in front of you every turn you make. Not only that, it's a good speed dampener. It forces you to drive slowly, to be more contemplative, which is the idea in a cemetery. So let's see how that plays out as you go through Oakwood. Those of you who've been with us before know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who may not have been to the cemetery yet, you'll see exactly what Engelhardt had in mind. So come with us. All right, you see Engelhardt's thought as soon as you enter Oakwood Cemetery. If we're headed for the office, you see it's not a straight line to it. I see a gravesite in front of us. That's Stanhope Pullen, by the way, for those of you from Raleigh. But then we make a curve. On your right, you have the old horse pasture, and on your left, you have this shift in topography. You have this gentle hill that rises up to the left. Every time we make a turn here, the vista in front of us changes. That's the point. Here I'm going to make a right as we head for the office. And our vista changes again. We have this, again, note the topography on your right. You have the hill that rises to the right. Engelhardt would call this interesting. All right, we're still driving, only now we're going from the office to Chapel Circle. But look how we have to go. Every turn we make, the vista changes. Down the hill, up the hill, off to the left. Notice how the vista changes as we go. Up to the right. Not exactly a straight line from the office to Chapel Circle, is it? And I'm going to turn right up here at this intersection. So again, the point being, you get different glimpses of nature as you go through the Garden Cemetery. We're on Chapel Circle now, which was to have been, and in fact was, from the 1890s, a chapel. As we go around, again, I think reflecting, just the circle reflecting the interesting road, I think. So once again, you see the vista changes as we go. And I think you get the idea. All right. I hope you enjoyed our little excursion through the cemetery. Nobody car sick, we hope. Another point to make about the Cemetery Association and the architecture of Oakwood Cemetery is that initially, anyway, the association paid little attention to structures on the ground. Why? Because what was most important to the Cemetery Association was what's most important to a cemetery, and that is the ground. They put the resources of the cemetery into manicuring Oakwood instead of building buildings. And it wasn't until the 1890s that Oakwood got its first structure, and that's behind us here. Robin's panning over to the receiving vault, built in the 1890s to receive, if you will, bodies intended for burial, but for some reason there was a delay in the actual interment. Up in New England, they have burial vaults because the ground can be too hard to dig. In the South, it could be other things. All sorts of things might delay a funeral, and this building would be used. Now, one of the principles that Engelhardt talks about in his book about structures in a cemetery is that they should be coherent and consistent. He really doesn't tell you what style to use, but that it should reflect the general tone of the cemetery. You will see, as we see some other examples of what's here at Oakwood, that this building is not consistent. That is, it's got the brownstone on it as opposed to the other buildings, and I think that's because the association realized this was out of the way. This is it's out of sight, so that it didn't have to reflect the architecture of the other structures in the cemetery. Let's go look at some of those. All right, the cemetery chartered in 1869, but it wasn't until around 1910 that they actually got an office. We aren't quite sure how they sold property up to that point, but the office, certainly a handsome building, and I think a nice reflection of the atmosphere of the cemetery. I guess one would call it some sort of combination between Romanesque and Gothic in terms of its style. But again, a handsome building, and we'll see the same in some other structures in the cemetery here. And a later structure in the cemetery is the House of Memory, dedicated in the 1930s, 1935. It is dedicated to the memory of any Tar Heel, man or woman, who gives his or her life on behalf of the country. And most American wars are remembered inside with various plaques. But again, you see the consistency of the style of the building with the office. And I think Engelhardt would have been very pleased with that. All right, we've seen a number of elements that Engelhardt said would be part of a landscaped or garden cemetery, but what's the most important one besides topography for creating scenery? No doubt in Engelhardt's mind, it was trees. And you see that in any landscape cemetery, including Oakwood. Robin's panning around, just to remind you, if you haven't been out here. Here's a picture of, you see, this is Mount Auburn up in Massachusetts. This is a print. You see the importance of trees. And there's a photograph which shows just how prominent they become in some cases. The trees almost obscure the fact that it's a cemetery. And maybe that's part of the idea. But the importance of trees may explain why it was so easy in the 1870s to hire, as Oakwood's second superintendent, a man named Asa Forrest, appropriately named, a Union soldier of all things, hired to run this cemetery. Why was it appropriate? Because he was a nurseryman. In fact, he ran a nursery within yards of where we're standing now. I think his specialty was magnolia trees, and a lot of the magnolias that are planted all over the city of Raleigh are due to Asa Forrest, a man who understood the importance of trees and whose work is reflected in Oakwood to this day. This is now an official arboretum. They've begun to tag trees by types. I think 25 or so species have been tagged in Oakwood Cemetery. I think Asa Forrest would be pleased, and so would Heinrich Engelhardt. All right, well, we're going to leave the historic section of Oakwood, the original 35 acres of the cemetery, and we'll talk about how the cemetery changed. But before we leave the historic section, take another look at Engelhardt's map. And you see the other thing that he put on it that said was important for landscape cemeteries, and that is water features. And originally Oakwood Cemetery did have several lakes and ponds on the grounds, but it became so difficult to maintain them. They silted up, they became stagnant, some of them. We have examples of people who skated on it and fell through the ice. We had young kids who would be playing in them when people were trying to mourn at graveside, so it didn't work. I'm going back to a print that I showed you earlier of Mount Auburn. Robin's coming in for another close-up, and I use this to show you trees, but notice the water feature in the middle of it, and I can guarantee you that whoever was maintaining the grounds of Mount Auburn had problems keeping keeping that water feature attractive, clean, and neat. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's been turned into grave sites or a garden. Anyway, we do have a stream that flows through Oakwood Cemetery, but in terms of the ponds and so forth that Engelhardt would have liked to see, it didn't work for us. Anyway, we're going to go into the new section now. The section developed after the Second World War, and you'll see just how different it is, and we'll talk about why that happened. So, come with us for just a few more minutes. All right, we're going into the newer section now. Again, developed not until after the Second World War. You notice some changes right away. First of all, relatively flat. We've lost the rolling hill topography that went with the old section. In fact, Engelhardt would have said to mound it up artificially, but the cemetery chose not to do that. Notice how straight this road is. The point being to get from one spot to another in as efficient a manner as you could. Of course, they don't give up on it being attractive. They planted these trees along it to still make it a lovely site. It's just a different design. Notice the markers. We're going to talk more about those, but you notice how they tend to be relatively similar, but there are important differences. But you don't see the big markers that were seen after the war in the historic section as being somewhat ostentatious. Okay, we're going to make a turn here, but again, it's a turn from one straight road into another. So again, it's quite a bit different than the atmosphere of the historic section. In terms of structure, we're going to pass the mausoleum. Initially went up in the 1970s, added to later on, and another straight road on the other side. So again, you're getting a good view of the new section, and you see just how different it is from the old. Robin does much better behind the wheel. A much smoother ride. Turn here, and we'll talk a bit about these stones and how they differ from the past, but how they are unique and interesting in their own way. So let's get out and take a walk through some of the new section here. Now notice again how the stones tend to be, you simply don't see the big obelisks. You don't see the familial divisions that you do in the old section. But what do you see? you see very personalized stones. You see stones that may not be big, but they perhaps are a much better reflection of the person who's memorialized there. You see the Fischetti family. He was an engineer, and you see a structure that marks his spot. In fact, he's the man who was responsible for the
Cape Hatteras Lighthouse.
Lighthouse. Yes, indeed. And you see that in countless stones in the new section. Let's take a walk. I suspect that Mr. Burgess liked to fish. Perhaps Mrs. Burgess too, or that they had a rural retreat that's reflected on their stone. You might see a smallish garden planted to mark a family's grave location. You might see a photo. In fact, not only a photo, this is a good stone, a good sample. Not only does it have Miss Sacco's picture, but it has something that they must have enjoyed, a quote from John Muir, and a engraving of a mountain scene. And a photo of the couple. And they've done their own plantings, and they protected them from the deer who wander through here with little cages. So again, it's not what you see in the older section, but it has its own character. Something that I think modern families may be much more comfortable with than with some of the grand monuments up in the old section. All right, well, thanks for coming with us today to go through Oakwood Cemetery and let us show you how it evolved. And since we're really talking about the evolution of burial custom, we thought we would add a footnote and bring you up to date. A very popular method of interment today is in natural cemeteries, natural grave spaces. And Oakwood has its own natural, or green, I should say, green burial section, relatively new within the last few years. But again, in a way, it takes you way back to the earliest burial customs. In the natural section, you have no outer vault. Your grave wrapping needs to be biodegradable. So again, it's a reflection of nature, just as the original landscaped or garden cemetery in its own way was to be a reflection of nature too. So we'll end our tour today with a look at the green burial section. See a very different view than what you saw in the historic section of Oakwood or in the new section. Down at the far end, I don't think you may not be able to make it out in Robin's photography, but those are beehives. The cemetery has its own beehives. Again, sticking with the natural theme. So, you've seen the full range of burial customs that are reflected in Oakwood, and we hope you've enjoyed your tour today. A little different than usual. We hope you'll join us for our next one too. Thank you.